Hey there, nerds. It looks like Assassin's Creed Shadow will in fact run on the Steam Deck after all. This comes from a tweet from Ubisoft, but I found it over at Polygon. Ubisoft says, many of you have been asking about Steam Deck. We are happy to say that we are supporting Steam Deck at launch and are currently awaiting the level of classification from Valve. More info to come soon. I have to say, I am skeptical. I'm glad that the game is supposed to be able to run on the Steam Deck, but I'm skeptical that it's actually going to work out the way that Ubisoft is hoping, for a few reasons, and that's what we're talking about in this episode. By the way, if you're new here, I'm Bill, and this is the NerdNest, my channel all about the gaming industry. I do news breakdowns, hardware reviews, and podcasts, so if that sounds good, click on subscribe. I'm currently sitting around 80,000 subscribers, and it would be really amazing to hit 100K this year. This news is a massive about-face from what Ubisoft had said previously. In fact, before, Ubisoft had said that the game would not be supported on the Steam Deck because the Steam Deck was, quote, below our minimum specs for PC. Well, it seems like PRF from Ubisoft spoke too soon because Assassin's Creed Shadows is now going to be supported at launch on the Steam Deck according to Ubisoft's latest post. So maybe they made some last-minute optimizations and the game is going to run fine. But since they brought up the minimum specs, let's talk about the recommended and required specs for Assassin's Creed Shadows. For recommended specs, which means that the game is running at 1080p, medium settings, and targeting 60 frames per second, Ubisoft recommends that you have an Intel i5 11600K or an AMD Ryzen 5 5600X. With a 3060 GPU if you're on NVIDIA's side, or if you use an AMD GPU, a 6700 XT GPU with 12 gigs of RAM. For minimum specs, Ubisoft says will get you 1080p at 30 frames per second, low specs targeting 30 frames per second. You'll need an Intel Core i7 8700K, or if you use AMD, you'll need a Ryzen 5 3600 for a CPU. For a GPU, you'll need a GTX 1070 or a Radeon 5700 with 8 gigs of RAM. So let's talk about let's take a look at the Steam Deck and its specs. And the Van Gogh chip is an AMD chip with 4 cores and 8 threads, which runs at roughly 2.5 gigahertz. This is roughly equivalent to an AMD Ryzen 3 3750 on the GPU side of things. This is roughly equal to a GTX 1050 or an AMD RX 570. It isn't a perfect comparison, but it's close enough for the napkin math that we're doing here, especially when we keep in mind how well optimized the Deck's operating system is for running games. It is also worth pointing out that the maximum resolution of the Steam Deck is lower than 1080p, all the way down to 800p. So even though the Deck is essentially weaker than the recommended specs, it's lower resolution. And if you combine that with the use of FSR for upscaling, maybe you'd be able to run the game lower than 800p and then upscale it to 800p. It'll probably look pretty ugly and you'll see a lot of weird upscaling artifacts, but it might be playable, maybe even 30 frames per second. Though we also have to consider that the Steam Deck only has 16 gigs of RAM. And that 16 gigs of RAM sounds great until you realize that it is shared between the CPU and the GPU. So video RAM might be an issue on the Deck. Now, on devices with more RAM, like say the ROG Ally X, which has 24 gigs of RAM, or the Lenovo Legion Go S, which can be configured with up to 32 gigs of RAM, they might handle the game better, although the Legion Go S is actually running a weaker chip than the original Legion Go and the Ally and Ally X, so maybe not. It's really up in the air how handhelds are going to handle this game. Regardless, we've seen lots of games that shouldn't run on PC gaming handhelds run just fine on them, depending on what your definition of fine is. I think that should be up to individuals to decide, but Ubisoft is waiting on Valve to decide what they have to say about it. Now, Valve has 4 categories of games that run on Steam Deck. They have verified, playable, unsupported, and untested. Just a reminder, in order for a game to get the coveted verified tag, a game has to meet 4 criteria that I have on the screen right now. Playable usually means that you can get around whatever issues are getting in the way by using the touchscreen or a mouse and keyboard, but the game should still run. If there are things that get in the way of a game running at all, then it would be considered unsupported. But it is important to know that there are plenty of games that are verified by Valve that play like garbage on the Steam Deck because Valve doesn't, well, they don't have a rubric that says how many frames per second specifically that a game has to maintain in order to be verified or playable. These ratings aren't about performance. They're much more about can the game launch since they're running Linux instead of Windows, not how good the experience actually is. There are also tons of games that are marked as unsupported, but they run just fine on the Steam Deck. So Valve's verified program, and I've complained about this a million times, it isn't super useful here. No matter what Valve says, I would hold off and look elsewhere to see how this particular game runs on the deck after it comes out. My recommendation is to check out proton.db. Needless to say, I certainly would not recommend people pre-order this game based on whatever Valve or Ubisoft tell you about it. I'm quite skeptical that it is going to run well on Steam Deck and maybe not even well on the other PC handhelds that have more RAM. But I am happy to be wrong. But I'd also recommend waiting until the game comes out and see the reviews first anyway. Speaking of reviews that have nothing to do with the performance of the game, Assassin's Creed Shadows hasn't been reviewing particularly well, mostly because of the two protagonists and how they play so differently, which honestly on paper sounds really cool, but in execution, it feels like, from what I understand, that Ubisoft has fumbled the ball here. Naoe, hopefully I said that right, is the traditional assassin character, but this time Ubisoft decided to add in a second character, Yasuke. I was actually more interested in playing as him myself because he doesn't play like an assassin. He plays more like a tank that can blast through a wall and fight 20 guys at once. Think the guy that plays Reacher. I think his name's Alan Richson. That dude is an absolute monster, which, like I said, is compelling to me. But the game still requires some assassin creeding, I guess is how I would say it, which means that you need to use Naoe sometimes, whether you want to or not. And switching characters isn't seamless. You can't just push a button and switch between them. It basically forces you into a load screen, which breaks all of the tension of the game. So if you want your Assassin's Creed game to play like an Assassin's Creed game, well, then you have to play as Naoe. But if you want to play as a samurai, then you are limited as to what you can do, and you are forced to switch to the other character, whether you like it or not. And that just seems like bad game design to me. And I get what they were going for, but I'm disappointed that if the reviews are to be listened to, that they didn't really nail the execution here. But even if the reviews were amazing, I still wouldn't pre-order anyway, especially Ubisoft games, as I don't want to support their pre-order scam nonsense. I'm looking at you, Star Wars Outlaws. I will say that if you are looking for a portable version of feudal Japan, I would suggest that you check out Ghost of Tsushima. Friend of the show, Noah, over at Steam Deck HQ, says that the game runs fantastically well on the Steam Deck. I have not tried it myself, but I did play it on PlayStation, and it is a really fun game. Beautiful, and I love the way that they have hidden all of the UI elements to better immerse you in the moment-to-moment gameplay. It's just absolutely fantastic, and it is basically an open-world game set in feudal Japan, very much like Assassin's Creed Shadows. But that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching, and if it's your first time here, please subscribe. From the Nerd Nest, I'm Bill. Stay rad, and thanks for watching.